Hello all, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're gonna go ahead and get into part one of a Growspace update. I've decided since my collection is a bit large, we're gonna go ahead and break it down into parts. And in this part one, we're gonna talk about my Paphiopedilums, my favorites. So jumping in, my Paphs are grown here on the lower shelves, which are a few degrees less than all the upper shelves. They also receive a little less light than all the other orchids because the light does trickle down to the bottom shelf, and my bottom shelves only have one grow light in the front in case I have a bloom or two and I need to direct them to the proper source of light so they don't go crazy and grow all out the shelves, which I do have some experience with. Now, I do notice that most of my Paphs, I don't own cold growers, but most of my Paphs do enjoy the slightly cooler temperature there on the bottom shelf. So my ambient temperature is somewhere between 73 and 75, and the bottom shelves will consistently be between 70 and 73. Which they again enjoy. So right now in the spring season, we have lots of vegetative growth. We have a few in blooms, some in spike. Currently, my lights are under about 13.5 hours. We'll be moving that slowly up to in between 14 and 16 as the summer progresses and how I see the plants reacting. So far, they have been moved up just 1.5 hours from the 12-hour mark coming out of the cooler seasons. Now, we're gonna go ahead and jump into the bottom shelf. Now, I do have 3 shelving units, and this one here is on the bottom left. Now, in my environment, I do have what I consider micro environments. So this bottom left shelf is actually going to be on the warmer end of the cooler temperature that I have here going on at the bottom. So again, I had mentioned that the temperatures on the bottom shelves are between 70 and 73. This side of the shelf here on the left is consistently between 70 and 73, and will be more leaning towards the 73 Fahrenheit. Now, as you can see, I do grow most of the greener leaf, less mottled leaf Paphs here because they tend to enjoy the slightly warmer temperatures. Many of them, maybe one, have bloomed. Most of them haven't bloomed for me just yet. So I'm here enjoying the vegetative growth. Now to get into a few so I can show you some examples of exactly what's going on here. First, we have my American hybrid, also known as the Bulldog Paph. Her name is Cheryl Ann Boyd. Again, she is a hybrid, hasn't bloomed for me, but she actually may be in spike. We have something here in the center of the plant, so I'm pretty excited about that. Moving on to Richardianum. This baby actually used to be considered a lowii, a variation of lowii. It is a species Paph, and I actually bought it in spike, and it bloomed for me about 2 years ago, and since then, it's put on 2 new growths. I noticed that in the cooler season, the growths have slowed, and it wasn't even just because of the cooler season. The plant actually needs a repot. There's some degraded bark, so we can look out for that video coming up. And moving on, we have a couple of Roth hybrids. Rothschildianum, also known as the king of Paphiopedilums, tends to be a bit of a tricky bloomer, but can have some easier habits when it's hybridized. Another trait when hybridizing the Roth, which is a very huge Paph, is that the hybrids tend to be smaller than the Rothschildianum. So here I have my Dalgaldi, which is a Roth crossed with Armeniacum, big yellow plant, my Gloria Noggle, which is crossed with my Cranthum, a very red plant, or excuse me, should give this hybrid a very red appeal. And very similarly, the Del Rosie, which is the Roth cross with Delanatii, also a red plant, red bloom. I really love these hybrids. I haven't bloomed them yet, but their foliage is is just so beautiful. The leaves are thick. The patterns vary depending on what they pick up from another plant, and they're just gorgeous. Next, I have another species down here, my Philippinense, which is a very large tropical growing Paph. Not much going on here, but I do have a new growth that has been speeding up since the growth season started. The older growth did slow during the colder season before this baby popped up, but now it did pick up growth and hopefully we'll have a bloom this year. Lastly, on this shelf, I do have a Paph that did bloom for me last year, Paph Simplicity, which is a cross of Villosum and Trainlianum. Weird name, but a beautiful bloom. After the bud fell, I went and repotted it into a long cup because I noticed the roots were filling the pot, and I just want those roots to go completely down. Next, let's move to the middle shelf. Here on the middle shelf, you can primarily see that I grow most of my mottled leaf Paphs. Now that is primarily because this shelf stays the coolest of all the shelves in my Growspace. So again, that temperature range of 70 to 73 Fahrenheit, this one's gonna stay an average of 70. Now, with regard to the growth and grow season, again, regardless of the mottled or just green strap leaves, we have lots of growth regarding new roots, new fans, and overall plant growth. Now, one plant in particular that I wanted to speak about growing on the bottom shelf here is the Malapoense, as you can see. My Malapoense did spike in the beginning of spring as winter left, as this plant normally does. It should give me a big green bloom on a very tall spike, and the bloom should be actually fragrant. So this Paph should have a almond milk sort of scent. I've even heard some people describe it as raspberries, but I've heard the almond scent a bit more shared. Now, I do have a video on mottled leaf Paphs, which you can check out, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on these, just to primarily say, remember I was talking about the leaves on those green leaves? Well, these leaves are to die for. The modeling is gorgeous. They always have something to show, regardless if the plant is in bloom or out of bloom. And I really love them because they grow a lot faster than the green leaves. So you can not only have a bloom, but possibly a second once that cool down does happen again. So the plant can bloom all year round essentially, especially if you grow under lights and in a controlled temperate environment such as myself. So we're gonna go ahead and just move to my third shelf, since it's very interesting because on that shelf I have more Paphs, but just the ones that are struggling. So let's move it along. So here on the third shelf on the bottom, we have the Paphs that I'm not necessarily struggling with, but I can't seem to figure them out. So they're the closest to the humidifier, and they're under sort of a medium lower light than the rest. And this shelf, because it's all the way to the right, does receive a bit of the natural sunlight, a bit more of the natural sunlight that does come through my living room window. Now, the challenges I'm having with some of these plants are going to be bud blasts, over underwatering, as well as just weird growth habits. So I'll go ahead and pull out the examples. First, with the bud blast, my Paph micranthum, which is a species. This baby required a cool, dry rest and less watering right before the inflorescence pops out for the bloom. So this one is kind of known to be a cooler, sometimes even a colder grower, requiring that drastic drop in the winter with less water. And in my environment, I've struggled to maintain it. I'm able to get the plant to spike. I'm able to get the buds to appear, but they blast before even coming out. and that has to do with the plant being overwatered. And I don't necessarily overwater any of my plants, but this plant does require a drier rest, and a drier cooling time when it needs to bloom. So far, it actually tried to bloom twice, and I've blasted both. So hopefully on one of these newer growths, and now that it's in a smaller pot with sort of a semi-hydro setup, I'm gonna make sure that it dries. I only bottom water it. Gonna make sure that it completely dries before I water again. Aside from the growing season that we're in, all my paths will remain moist through the summer season. It is only during that cool during the cooler resting slash blooming season for most, or for this one in particular, that I'm going to change the watering routine as well as fertilizing regimen. Now moving on, the next one is an overwatering problem that I had. So this is Paphiopedilums, a species, the one with the yellow leaf here. Now, when I first got it, it did have 2 fans and immediately bloomed and put out the second fan. And the last fan, actually, I got water in it. So it ended up rotting and completely setting the plant back because the new growths stopped growing. They are growing now, but that overwatering issue I had was because I had a top layer of moss. And some of my paths do have moss in the pot, but I don't layer it. The moss is throughout the pot or maybe concentrated on the top of the pot, depending. And for this path, the moss has been put throughout the pot. I don't know too much about its natural native environment, but ever since I did this switch, it has been growing a bit better, and I'm just waiting for this yellow leaf to drop off, and I'm gonna move it over to grow with the mottled leaf paths. Now, I know the leaves aren't mottled here, but because of the environment is the reason I'm gonna move it from this area. Moving along, I have Paph Paracine, which had a challenge with underwatering. I lost all the roots. It only has 1 fan, and the fan has just started to put out a new leaf. I was going to trash the plant, but the new leaf coming out has given me some hope, so I'm just gonna leave the plant alone and see what it does. Next, I have Paph Henry Faverlong. This is a cross between Leucoxylum and Henry Anum, and I don't necessarily have a problem with this plant, but it did also get water in the crowns of the older fans and stop growing. But then it just shot out so many new fans that I thought that the plant was doing something and telling me that there's a problem here and I'm trying to survive. So I repotted it into a smaller pot so that I can get a better wet dry cycle. So now it gets watered in tandem with the rest of the paths. I found out that it wasn't a smaller pot, and I don't know if maybe I was over fertilizing, but the pot was drying too fast, and coming up to fertilizing time, the pot was completely dry. So I think it was just taking up the nutrients a bit too fast, especially with regard to the seaweed. I do add seaweed to my waterings outside of the fertilizer, so I just think it had a negative reaction to that. So I'm just monitoring this path to see where it goes. Now, moving along, the best part, we're going to go into some of the paths that I actually have in bloom. Actually, rewind. We're gonna go to paths that I didn't touch that are in some of the other growing areas. So I'm just gonna keep the frame here on the bottom shelf. But I do have a couple of paths that I grow with the novelties because they require a bit of a warmer all-around season. So that's Paph Pinky, that's a cross of Tyanum and Philippinense. Then we have a species path here. I lost the tag, so I'm not sure if it's Godefroy or Leucoxylum, but generally they require the same warm care and bright lights. Next, we have Chu Yi Rookie, which is a cross of, I believe, Tyanum and Rothschildianum. So I have that growing up here on the top shelf, as well as Emersonii. Emersonii is a species that may require a cooler grow environment as with regard to what I've read, but in my environment, it reacts very well to the warmer temperatures on the higher shelves since I moved it up from the bottom shelf. So it's going to stay there. And lastly, I'm going to leave you all with a little collage of what I have in bloom. I have a couple of Paphs in bloom. So here going into, we have the Ho Chi Minh, which is very beautiful. This is a cross of Delanatii and Vietnamense. It's one of my favorites that I have in bloom. Very vigorous plant and beautiful mottled leaves and a gorgeous bloom. No scents here, but the blush of pinks between the dark and the light and the small speckling in the pouch. It's a gorgeous plant. Next we have Path Psych, which is actually just in spike. This plant was actually one of the first Paphs I ever purchased back in August of 2020. And here we have another bloom in my care. It does have another division that's not in bloom on a higher shelf, but I just wanted to focus on this since the baby's in spike. Moving along, Shirley Admonson has proven to be quite the vigorous grower. The plant puts out fan after fan, and I actually had 2 blooms simultaneously from different fans. Currently, it only has 1 bloom that just opened a few days ago, so decided to share that. And I'm gonna put up a picture of the plant in all its glory with both of its blooms as well. Moving along, we also have a species, Path Argus. I love this path. It has so many features in the bloom, including speckling, the hairiness along the petals, and a veined pouch. It's a gorgeous plant. I highly recommend going into the species Paphiopedilums because they're fun to grow and they seem to have these weird, beautiful, striking blooms that will probably bloom once a year, but they last so long you won't notice that you're only getting one every 365 days. And lastly, I'm gonna leave you with the cutest bloom in my collection. This is Paph QF Winona. Not sure what the crosses are here, but it's such a tiny plant. And this is the second bloom within the year. It did bloom last year, but what I mean is it's the second bloom within 365 days. So it's a gorgeous Paph to enjoy. You can go ahead and tuck it actually in a bookshelf or something because it's a very low light orchid. And with all those blooms, I'll leave you with my see you next video. I'll go ahead and put my social media handles on the screen for anyone who wants to follow me off of YouTube. I go by the right Paph, indicative of Paphiopedilums, my favorite orchids here. And you can follow me on Instagram or Facebook where I do post quite a lot. And I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.